Hello and welcome to my fourth entry in my series on the first 6 Saw films. As you've probably surmised, this episode is all about Saw 4. And as such, the first 3 sections of this video will contain spoilers up to and including Saw 4, while the last 2 sections will have spoilers for Saw 1 through 6. I will clearly indicate at which point I am switching over to the last 2 sections, and that this will be the point at which you should stop watching if you have not yet seen Saw 5 and 6. But I do invite you to come back to this video and watch those last 2 sections after you have done that. Assuming, of course, that you're interested enough in returning. As always, all of these sections will be time-coded in the description so that you can skip or jump around as much as you like. But okay, let's talk about Saw 4.
Subject's name is John Kramer, a 52-year-old male Caucasian. He's seen better days.
So I absolutely love this autopsy scene. Jigsaw obviously dies at the end of Saw 3, and so when people became aware that they were making a Saw 4, I think many people might have suspected they would try and pull some kind of trick where, oh, John faked his death somehow, or God forbid they take some kind of turn that other long-running horror franchises have taken and bring Jigsaw back to life through supernatural means. And so starting this movie with the autopsy scene in which we watch John get completely taken apart, it's the filmmaker's way of telling us he's dead. He's definitely dead. He's not coming back from what you saw happen at the end of Saw 3. And while Jigsaw's story is indeed far from over, the storytellers are going to have to play by the established rules of the story in order to keep John around. And the way to do that is with the non-linear storytelling that the previous films already used extensively. So this scene serves as a really clever way to promise the audience that they're not using cheap gimmicks to bring Jigsaw back after killing him off in the last one. Instead, they will use the pre-existing narrative format to continue his story. And in that way, this whole sequence serves as a hint as to the structure of this film. After not being the biggest fan of Saw 3, I went into Saw 4 completely uncertain of what this story was going to be and where it was going, very skeptical that it would be any good. This moment in this opening scene where they actually provide an answer to one of my questions lingering from Saw 3, it quite quickly got me to a place where I was more open-minded towards this movie.
Are you there, detective? If so, you are probably the last man standing. Now perhaps you will succeed where the others have failed. You think you will walk away untested. I promise that my work will continue. You think it's over just because I'm dead. It's not over. The games have just begun.
Now, another really cool hint as to the big twist of this movie is that you can hear the Hello Zepp music playing in this scene when Hoffman plays the tape. In all 3 of the previous films, you hear that theme or some slight variation of it in the ending sequence of the movie when a character plays a tape, which, kind of reveals something. And here, we are hearing it when Hoffman plays the tape found in Jigsaw's body. And this is a neat clue that this is actually the last scene in the sequence of events that we're watching, and that everything we see after this scene actually takes place before that scene. And so yeah, immediately after Hoffman plays that tape, we cut to this scene in the mausoleum. And that transition point is the point at which we go back in time. The trap in the mausoleum is set approximately 2 weeks before the night of John's death. We know this because later one of the FBI agents says that Art Blank has been missing for 2 weeks. So if you were to combine Saw 3 and Saw 4 into one massive movie, the sequence of events would be Eric escaping the bathroom at the beginning of Saw 3, then 5.5 months later, this mausoleum scene, and then about a week to a week and a half later is Troy's trap at the school, followed by Carrie's trap, etc.
Amanda Young, the accomplice.
This wasn't done by Amanda Young.
So one way in which this scene specifically kind of cleverly misdirected me, at least, was the fact that they clearly know Amanda Young was an accomplice to Jigsaw. And the first time I was watching this, in my head, I'm thinking, well, yeah, because they discovered her body with his, they obviously clearly pieced together that she was helping him. But the reality is, they actually know she's involved because of Daniel Matthews. After the events at the nerve gas house, she obviously had to reveal herself in order to give him the antidote and then deliver him to Jigsaw. And since Daniel is discovered at the end of Saw 2, he obviously would tell the police that Amanda was in on the game.
Detective Carey weighed approximately 130 pounds. Amanda Young's arrest report has her at 107. She couldn't get her up there alone.
John Kramer was...
Bedridden cancer patient, he's brains, not brawn. And we're here to find the person your department couldn't, Detective, the one helping Jigsaw and Amanda Young.
Another cool clue here is that they're using present tense to discuss Amanda Young and John Kramer and the idea of someone helping them.
Why don't you tell me everything you know about John and let's start at the beginning.
John's life defying chronology. Linear description.
So this line in the interview tape with Jill, between her and Hoffman, it's the first example of many in which the dialogue is kind of hinting to the audience what's going on with the timeline. Here are some of the others.
So why don't we start at the end and let's work our way back.
I need time to explain, please.
I can't give you time. No one can. Time's an illusion. You see, things aren't sequential.
Boss, looks like another doctor went missing from the hospital. I think maybe it's,
Thanks. I'll check it out. If you need me, call my cell.
That last example is obviously less metaphorical than the other ones. The reference to the doctor is obviously Lynn, as they reveal at the end of the movie. But I wanted to include it because that stuffed monkey that Hoffman is holding was also a clue. You may or may not have recognized it as the same stuffed animal that Corbett, Jeff and Lynn's daughter, had with her when she was taken and when she's locked up at the end of Saw 3. So this moment served as a clue of both Hoffman's involvement and the fact that this movie was taking place at the same time as Saw 3.
Look closely. Eric Matthews is still alive. The block of ice he stands upon is melting.
So watching this the first time, I had no idea that Donnie Wahlberg was in this movie. And I thought it was a really excellent surprise to find both that he was in it and that Eric Matthews really did survive. I've heard people ask about why the ice didn't swing down and crush Eric's head when Art came through the door. And the answer is that you can actually see him arm it when he closes the door behind him and locks the door. He doesn't seem to have realized that's what he's done, but it seems to have been part of his instructions to lock the door.
You out of your fucking mind!
This movie was really the one that started embracing the idea of these flashback cameos. The man that Cecil gets in the altercation with is Gus from Saw 2, the one that gets shot from the door. And there are a couple of other recognizable faces in the background. Okay, so something that I think was definitely confusing for me when the first several times I saw this, I don't think I actually understood it until I had listened to the audio commentary for Saw 4. But that is, why does that clue, if you will, about go back to where it all began, Why does that randomly trigger that flashback for Rig? And it's really impossible to understand why that is until you know that Saw 4 is taking place at the same time as Saw 3. And even after that, it can be pretty difficult to figure out. But the answer is that this whole series of events of Saw 3 and Saw 4 kicks off with Troy's game. You know, Jigsaw hasn't been active since they last saw him when they almost arrested him. And then 6 months later, they find Troy's game at the school. And that's what kicks off this new series of games. So when Rig reads that, he connects it to the beginning of this series of events. And because he had already had a previous experience at that school, he also has that flashback. Obviously, the part that references becoming the teacher is also meant to help him make the connection to that school. But yeah, you can even see when Rig arrives at the school, there's a room with the crime scene tape. And that is the room where Troy's game was played. If you have a really good eye for detail and a good memory, then yeah, you could have recognized this hallway as the same one that we saw at the beginning of Saw 3. I was not one of the people that caught on to that.
There you go. Live or die. You make the choice.
So as I pointed out in my last video, we once again, for the 4th film in a row, have a gun with 1 bullet.
Look at this. What is this? Why do you have Cecil's picture? What have you done to him?
So this is something I always find interesting. Jill shows up asking about Cecil because of a newspaper article. I could be wrong on this, but I don't feel like a newspaper would print an article about Cecil going missing. So I've always taken this to mean that his body was found, which would make sense since he is later shown on the list of known Jigsaw victims. So this is where we kind of get the origin of why John uses pig masks. Earlier on, Jill asks Agent Strom how much he knows about the Chinese zodiac, and then says that she didn't just get pregnant, it was planned out by John. The implication here is that John wanted a child to be born in the year of the pig. And so, much like the original Billy doll that he intended to give to his unborn son, both the Billy puppet and the pig masks are representations of the child that he lost. Also, the clay statues that we see Cecil stealing, you actually can see those in Saw 3 set up around the operating room that John is in.
What's happened to you?
So Saw 4 took the series' nonlinear storytelling to a whole new level in this installment. Not only in the sense that it occurs, you know, at the same time as Saw 3, but also in the sense that it gives us flashbacks within flashbacks. I feel like that's probably a point of criticism for some people, but I personally feel like it's a big part of what gives this series its defining puzzle piece nature. So here you see the remnants of Jeff's crate that he woke up in at the beginning of his game in Saw 3, as well as the first box in which he found the key and the note that says open the door. Much like Saw 2, this is kind of telling us in advance of the actual reveal what is going on. I remember being in the theater and seeing Jeff appear here and being very confused. Throughout this movie, I kept wondering whatever happened to Jeff. You know, the opening scene is the autopsy of John's body, and I'm thinking, well, then surely they would have found Jeff. Was he alive? Was he dead? Did he get his daughter back? What was the game that he was supposed to play? And I just didn't feel like they were going to address it at all, and I thought that was very weird and, you know, annoying. And then when he shows up here, at first I'm thinking, oh my God, is he still playing some kind of game from after Saw 3? And then it was the shot of him hitting the light with the hook where, you know, my brain started to click. I was like, wait a minute, we already saw that. And that's where my brain just started like melting, trying to like make sense of this. And it was really where we see Jeff emerging and we hear John and Amanda talking. That was really where my brain started to accept, like, okay, so everything after the autopsy must be happening at the same time as Saw 3. And then, yeah, like retroactively, my mind is like, you know, recontextualizing everything that I've been watching for this hour and a half, while also trying to keep up with the actual climax of this movie that's still playing out on screen. And me describing it that way, it actually kind of sounds awful. And maybe that was some people's experience with it, but I loved it. Like I was literally so blown away by like, yeah, just again, after 3 movies of them giving us these twists and playing around with our perception of time, I was very impressed that they got another one by me that I absolutely did not see coming in the slightest. It's even like the inverse of the Saw 2 twist. You know, the big reveal in that one is that these 2 storylines that you think are happening at the same time actually aren't. Whereas it's the opposite case with Saw 4. You think that it's not happening at the same time as the storyline from Saw 3, when in fact it really is. I'll talk a bit more about that in my review and analysis section, but yeah, I was a fan of this twist. And yeah, one of the things that I really loved about this movie is the way that it completely recontextualizes Saw 3. So much of what John is saying in his last conversation with Amanda, it suddenly has all of this meaning when you go back and rewatch that, having now seen Saw 4. When he tells her, succeed in this, and we all succeed, fail, and we all fail. And then when she shoots Lynn, and he says, you've just destroyed 4 lives. This is because he knows that if Amanda kills Lynn, Jeff is going to come in with that 1 bullet and kill Amanda. And then he's going to be that much more likely to give in to his revenge and kill John. Doing so will seal the door, and then John will reveal the tape that tells him that he has Jeff's daughter. And this ensures that Jeff is stuck in that room waiting for something to happen, and that the only person with a key to that room is Agent Strom, who will obviously go in armed. And Jeff, you know, in shock and, you know, angry about his daughter, has that empty gun, will, you know, of course be threatening and brandishing that weapon, resulting in his death. If he had passed his test and forgiven John, then everything would have played out fine. The FBI agent would have arrived, the door wouldn't have been sealed, and, you know, he would have been able to assess the situation and get an ambulance for Lynn. But because Jeff failed his test, it results in a scenario that was guaranteed to end in his death. So yeah, when Amanda shoots Lynn, John knows that she has effectively killed all 4 of the people present. So like the last 2 films, this one actually has multiple twists. We already talked about, you know, the timeline one, which is certainly my favorite. And then we have the Hoffman one, which I didn't find particularly shocking or even that interesting, really, since we didn't really know that much about him as a character. But the third twist is that Rigg was supposed to just not go to Eric and he would have been fine. And while that didn't like affect me to the same level that the timeline twist did, I was also a big fan of this twist, because it was another one that I also didn't figure out, but that in retrospect is absolutely what he was being told the whole time. All Rigg had to do was stay home and do nothing, and Eric would have been fine. Like I said, I didn't find the Hoffman reveal to be particularly shocking, nor did I find it particularly interesting, simply because we didn't know anything about him. But I didn't dislike it. I think a lot of people felt like, okay, so now they're just bringing in some random guy to take over for the much more interesting John Kramer. And given my initial reaction to the end of Saw 2, to the idea that Amanda was being set up to take over for Jigsaw and how that felt like sequel bait to me, it's completely understandable how people would expect me to have that reaction to this ending to Saw 4. But the reason I didn't, and the reason that it felt completely different to me, is what is said to Hoffman in Jigsaw's last tape to him. There's a very real indication here that the relationship between John Kramer and Detective Hoffman is not as simple as master and apprentice. With this tape, John is ominously warning Hoffman that he's not in full control, even though he may now feel like it. And so what this sets up for future installments isn't merely, okay, now this guy's the one, setting up these traps. It suggests a more interesting story of exploring who this guy is in relation to John, what their dynamic was, and what their differences were, as well as what is John referring to when he says that he is still among them. And while this can be said to be sequel bait, it's obviously setting this up for future movies, this film won me over completely in that regard. The way that its twist not only recontextualizes this film, but the previous film as well, it completely won me over and had me on board for the idea of this being a serialized episodic story. I finished Saw 3 thinking, okay, so I guess that's it. I guess that's how they're ending this, and being very unsatisfied. I finished Saw 4 thinking, oh wow, we're really just getting started on this story, and being incredibly excited for the next part of this story. So I think this one and Saw 6 are the two examples where the theatrical versions are kind of nonsense in certain areas, whereas the director's cuts actually make much more sense. The best example of this in Saw 4 is that in the theatrical cut, when Agent Strom and Agent Perez are first introduced, they're asking Hoffman if the last message from Carrie to them makes any sense to him. That message being, open the door and you will find me, and it comes with a key. And then it's never explained what that was about. But in the director's cut, we get an extra shot of Perez handing the key to Strom after she is injured. And then we see that Strom uses that key in order to unlock the door and enter the room where Jeff and the bodies of Jigsaw, Amanda, and Lynn are. For reasons that I will never be able to figure out, that is cut out of the theatrical version, and he just enters the room like the door was unlocked. So, yeah. So I guess if Strom hadn't happened to be right behind Jeff, then Jeff could have just walked out of that room and then Strom wouldn't have found him. I don't know. The director's cut also adds a scene where before Strom goes into the Gideon building, he calls for backup. This still doesn't completely explain away why he rushes out there by himself. I think you can somewhat reasonably explain that with, the timer ticking down so low and he's rushing to get out there instead of, rounding everybody up. I think that kind of works. But what definitely didn't work for me in the theatrical version is the idea that he didn't tell anybody that he was going out there. So the director's cut, adding the scene where, he's calling for backup and telling them where he's at, that makes a lot more sense. I don't know why that was cut out either. Another thing that I think makes a little more sense in the director's cut is the way in which Rigg captures Ivan. The theatrical cut, Ivan just kind of is wandering the hall. I feel like the implication was that he was searching for Rigg, but he would have no way of knowing which room he went into, so the idea that he would walk all the way down that hall seemed kind of silly. But in the director's cut, it shows that Rigg lured Ivan there by getting the dog's attention and bringing him up to the room, and that's why Ivan was walking down that hallway, was his dog was there sniffing the mask. Another difference between the theatrical version and the director's cut is there's a shot when somebody enters Rigg's apartment. There's this shot in the director's cut of somebody walking past Rigg's bedroom doorway.
Tracy.
I think that's a really cool, spooky shot. And again, I'm not clear on why this would have been cut out for the theatrical version, but it was. Another difference that I almost forgot to mention was that in the theatrical version, you actually see Hoffman like remove the fake cuff and get out of the chair. Whereas in the director's cut, you don't see that. You just see when Rigg turns and sees that he's standing there. That's the moment where it's revealed that Hoffman was somehow involved. I remember seeing a Reddit post a while back that was complaining about the fact that they cut that out. They basically voiced that they remembered the people they were watching it with being confused as to how Hoffman got out of the chair. And to be honest, I didn't really understand this point of view. I think the implication is quite clear when he says game over and the montage shows us, that he was probably involved. And then he wrote the letter to Amanda and he closes the door on Strom. All of that tells us that he was actually in on this game, and therefore there was obviously going to be a way for him to just get up and walk out of that room. And there's really nothing that extra scene of him getting up from the chair does to explain how he wasn't tied down. In both scenarios, it's just obvious that he was in on it, and one of his cuffs wasn't actually secured to the chair. And aside from all that, I prefer the idea of not seeing him get up, because then we get the realization that Hoffman was in on this at the exact same time that Rigg does. So yeah, that's why the director's cut version of this scene works a little better for me. And the last difference that I noted, although there probably are some other smaller ones, is that we see Strom call Agent Perez's family when he gets back to the police station.
Mrs. Perez? Yeah, hi, this is Peter Strom. I work with your daughter, Lindsay. Yeah. I have some bad news.
Okay, so we've reached the point in this series of films where it gets really difficult to review and analyze these movies as standalone films. Because if you look at this as just its own self-contained story, it doesn't make any sense. And in fact, I truly believe that is one of the big reasons that my opinion of this movie is so much higher than the general opinion of this movie. I remember watching this film in theaters with a full theater. It was opening weekend, and absolutely loving it and just being blown away by the ending. But as the credits started to roll and everybody else started to empty out of the theater, I remember just getting the very real sense that most people were very confused as to what it was they just watched. And that's when it dawned on me that most people weren't like me, where I, rewatched the first three films right before going and seeing the new one. A lot of them hadn't seen Saw 3 since a year ago when it first came out. And therefore, they tended to not understand, and certainly not appreciate, the fact that what was going on in this film and what was going on in the last one were intimately connected. And so yeah, from the viewpoint of a standalone film, it is not a good movie. It relies heavily on the audience having prior knowledge of the previous films, especially the last one, and it sets up much more story than it resolves. So from that perspective, it does fail in a way that the previous films, especially the first two, really didn't. But when viewed as an episode in a serialized narrative, I think it works a lot better. And I think that's a good place to transition into the last two sections of this video, which you should please not watch if you haven't seen Saw 5 and Saw 6. If you have not seen those, I ask you to please stop this video, but I do invite you to come back and finish it once you have seen those last two entries. So one more time for anybody that might have used the time codes in the description to skip ahead. If you have not seen Saw 5 and Saw 6, please do not watch these last two sections. Okay, So while Saw 3 was really the first one that began setting up this overarching narrative, this serialized story, Saw 4 is the one that actually made me understand that that's what Saw 3 was doing. I think most people like me watched Saw 3 and kind of thought that because John and Amanda died, that was going to be the last one. Even though I immediately recognized there were so many things in Saw 3 where it was just raising questions that weren't there before. Watching Saw 4 is where I suddenly understood that this was becoming a much bigger, more complex story. And it retroactively, drastically increased my appreciation for Saw 3 and my opinion of it. At the end of the first section, I already touched upon the introduction of Hoffman as more than merely another accomplice to Jigsaw, and how I found that to be an exciting setup for the future of the series, and how the tape that John left for Hoffman seems to hint at there being someone else, or maybe even multiple other people, doing John's bidding. And the fact that Riggs' game in this movie is very obviously Jigsaw trying to recruit him into his work. Combining that with Amanda and how she joined up with John after surviving her test, it sets up what I find to be an interesting idea of Jigsaw trying to cultivate a following. You know, before you had Amanda and it seemed like, okay, so he just picked one person to carry on his work after he dies. But from John's perspective, it would make a lot of sense to do that with more than one person. The question then becomes, what would be the individual motivations of these hypothetical other people that would be willing to help him in, you know, creating these traps in games and etc. The possibility of exploring such things was also very exciting to me. So one of the things that I'm a big fan of in the last half of this series is the way, or at least these first 6 installments, I should say, is the way that each one kind of recontextualizes not only itself, but the previous entries as well. And one of the reveals that we get near the end of Saw 6 definitely sort of recontextualizes something that Cecil says when he wakes up after John has taken him.
Give me time to explain, please.
In my mind, knowing now what is revealed at the end of Saw 6, I think this is him wanting to explain that he didn't even want to do it in the first place and that somebody else put him up to it. So in this last section, I kind of want to talk about some of the little loose ends that this film had that I hoped would be addressed in the conclusion to the series. This first one's kind of a small one, but you can see that when Hoffman is putting the letter in the envelope, you see him also drop an object in there. I was always curious as to what that was, considering that, you know, his letter doesn't seem to reference anything. Now, as I talked about in my last video, there did seem to be other contents in that envelope that John left for Amanda, and it is possible that whatever this object was something that John left her that Hoffman had removed before writing his letter and putting everything back in. But either way, I just kind of would have been interested to know what it was. On that note, Hoffman's writing of this letter kind of was the start of a line of questioning in my mind regarding his fingerprints. They would clearly be all over that envelope and the mask that he touches, and then at the end when he closes the door on Strom, his fingerprints should be all over this crime scene. While that may be a plot hole, I kind of always hoped and expected there to be an explanation for why this didn't come back around and bite him. It seems clear that it was always part of the plan for this location to be discovered by the police. So within the world of the story, it seems to me that there needed to be an explanation for why this wasn't going to be a problem for him. And similar to that, I always wondered what possible reason Hoffman would have for bringing the stuffed monkey into the police station with him. We know that Corbett had this monkey before she was abducted, and we know that she has it with her when she's locked up at the warehouse. So that means that the scene in which Hoffman has the monkey is after Hoffman has abducted Jeff and Corbett, but probably before he's taken them to the Gideon warehouse. So my question was always, why would he have not left the monkey in the car with them? Or if he had already dropped them off at the warehouse, why then did he still have the monkey? Maybe he forgot it in the car, but that still doesn't explain why he would bring it into the police station with him. Now, from an objective, real-world perspective, I realize that there's a real possibility that this was only done because they wanted it to be some kind of hint for the audience about Hoffman's involvement and about what was going on with the timeline. And while that is probably true, I think that the story owed us a in-universe explanation for that. And I really just have two last things that I would have preferred to have gotten a little bit more clarification on. The first is, why did John want his kid to be born in the year of the pig? And the second is, what exactly happened after Amanda turned around and went back to Eric? She clearly believes that she killed him, and he is left unconscious with blood coming out of his mouth, which seems to imply that something else happened. And she did walk away with that knife that he had been threatening her with. So yeah, I've just always been kind of curious what exactly happened in that last bit of the altercation that we never saw. But neither of those last two things do I think we were owed. I just think it would have been nice to get a little bit more clarification on those things. But okay, I believe that's everything I have for today's installment. I hope to see you guys in the next couple of days for Saw 5. Until then,
Game over.
Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the two boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.